The Ursa Cine 12K has one of the best sensors that I think I've ever shot on, but that doesn't mean that I love the camera. I've shot on cameras like the Alexa, the Mini LF, Venice 1, Venice 2, BRAW. I've shot on a lot of the major cinema cameras, but there's some quirks that I think are worth noting with the Ursa Cine 12K. Just to be totally clear, all of my experience with this camera is from 1 week of having it on set. I rented this camera for a spot. The spot's not out yet, so unfortunately I can't show any of the footage, but all of this is coming from 1 week of experience with the camera, so take it for what you will. I think there's a pretty large list of pros about this camera. Not all of them revolve around the sensor, but I think probably the biggest pro for me about this camera is that sensor. So let's kick it off with diving just into the sensor. Now, the person that did the best review on this was Team 2 Films. I watched his video like 30 times and I got to meet him at NAB. He dove into the technical aspects and he did some very, very good tests with this sensor. But that being said, just for the basics, it's an RGB-W sensor. And basically the way that I understand that it works is it records the white levels at these particular places, and then it integrates that into BRAW. That BRAW is taken into DaVinci, and then in DaVinci, you're able to click highlight stop recovery in case like your highlights are blown out just a little bit. It kind of gives a good estimation of where those highlights should land. One thing that I've always loved is the full frame look. I don't know why, but I guess I've always been drawn to it, probably from studying portraits whenever I was a kid. But that's something that I've always had a keen eye for and always wanted. So I started with Super 35 and then I graduated into the A7S1, which, you know, I thought was world changing at the time. And then I got into my first cinema bodies, and at that time full frame wasn't really an option that was economical or feasible for me. So I was Super 35 for a bit, and then whenever I got back into full frame, I've stayed full frame since. So that's something that really attracted me to this camera, was the 3x2 full frame sensor. Now, something that I really like is that you're able to shoot the entire sensor open gate in 12K, 8K, and 4K. You're able to down res in camera without losing any image quality. And again, the video by Team 2 Films does a very good job explaining how that works. And then the last thing about this sensor and this body combination is it has an insane readout speed, which also enables you to get some really high frame rates. A lot of the times I'm not shooting over 60 frames a second, but this camera can do 220 frames a second, which is a really cool tool to have in your back pocket in case you're breaking a plate or whatever and you want it in slow motion. Moving on to some physical characteristics that I like about the camera is one, the included low pass and internal ND system. The ND system is not necessarily my favorite because it goes in 0.6 stops and sometimes I just need a stop, but what I do like is that they included the ND system rather than just not including one at all. But if Blackmagic ends up hearing this and they're thinking about a new system, I think an internal END would be really cool. It'd be a nice addition for this camera. Another thing that I really like about the camera is the color changing buttons. Now, I'm not historically a guy that has shot a lot on the Blackmagic systems, but one thing that I liked and I thought was really handy when I was using this system is that when you'd press a button, you would see the colors change to indicate if the button had been pressed or what setting it was on. I think that that could be really cool on a set if you're running gunning and you need a quick visual of what's enabled and what's disabled, etc. So yeah, I like the way that that handshakes with the software and kind of shows you what's enabled and what's disabled. Now, I may be in the minority here, but something that I did like about this camera was the flip out screen. It's not something that is traditional on a lot of cinema bodies, and in fact, the screen that I was using on this camera didn't really seem calibrated. It always seemed a little bit too bright and too warm. But I liked that it was there. I kept using it, and in fact, for that whole week, I didn't rig up an additional monitor. Another thing that's great about this body is that you're able to use some of your older batteries, or you can switch over and use the new B mount. So the camera, you can use V mount, gold mount, or B mount. And with the B mount, you get everything that the camera can do. You get up to the 220 frames per second, you get the power IO, etc. Now, if you go down to some of the 12, 16 volt batteries, what you're going to get is you're going to lose some of your power out IOs, and then you're going to be limited on frame rates. I used V mounts for the week and we were limited to 60 frames a second. So it wasn't too bad. 60 frames a second is where we needed to be for a lot of that spot anyway, so it was fine. But it's cool that they give you the option to run on both 12 and 24 volts. Because a lot of us, if we're getting into this camera, are already going to have kind of an army of batteries that we use for our other cameras. I think Blackmagic also did a good job of integrating some standard connections with some new tech. So we have our traditional XLR, timecode, SDI, headphone, 7-pin LEMO, and Fisher ports, but what they also introduced was a locking USB-C for their monitors, a 10 gig Ethernet for media offload or streaming, as well as a USB-C for media offload. Now, the USB-C is a lot slower than the 10 gig Ethernet, so if you're using their media module, you will definitely want to buy a 10 gig Ethernet to Thunderbolt adapter for your computer. The USB-C is just terribly slow, but it's an option if you're in a pinch. The last bit on physical is that the camera overall felt really well built and well refined. I know there's been some mixed reviews on Blackmagic quality control in the past, and I'll get there in my con section, but this camera particularly felt like it was manufactured well. It felt strong and it didn't feel like it was going to break. It's built out of magnesium, and so it felt like it was a very solid unit, and I didn't feel like it felt cheap at all with the accessories or the body itself. It was a well manufactured camera, especially for the price. Then a huge pro for this camera is the Blackmagic UI. I'm not sure that there is a camera company that has a better user interface than Blackmagic. This felt like Apple dove in and designed a camera interface. Everything is intuitive, it's where I think it should be, and it's easy to understand. I feel like I could give this to a new film student or something and they would understand exactly where to go. If you have audio, you go to the audio tab. If you have video outs, you go to video output. If recording, you go to that section. So everything is very well placed and it just makes sense. Blackmagic did a very good job with their UI, and I feel like I stand on the hill that they have the best user interface of any camera. Now, of course, it's got some quirks and it's got some things that it can't do and that others can, but I think overall Blackmagic knocked it out of the park with their user interface. And then the last pro for this camera, which is probably the most obvious, and that's the price. This camera comes in just under $8,000, and for a image to price ratio, it's probably one of the better values out there. You can get the full kit and it's quite a bit more expensive, but with the recent price drop, you get a lot of bang for your buck. But that being said, there is some cons that I think are worth noting, and the first being that this camera is just extremely heavy. So once you rig this camera up, and I just had the camera rigged up with my glass and DJI SDR, and then a Tilta M follow focus kit, and then like a power splitter, but nothing else. And that camera was very, very heavy. I didn't put it on a scale, but it definitely didn't clock in lightweight. You knew whenever you had to pick it up, and then you were ready to set it down after you were shooting, especially when I was shooting handheld all week. This camera was noticeably heavy. And then piggybacking off of that, the camera itself just has an interesting form factor. It's almost kind of awkward form factor. You've got a screen on the side, and so if I'm handheld and then I'm holding my handle that I had rigged up front, my arm is all over this screen, and then you've got the flip out screen, which I like and I thought worked pretty well, but overall it felt like a quasi ENG camera trying to be a box camera. So the design of the camera, it offered a lot, but it just didn't feel right. And that may be something to do with the weight and all that stuff, and I appreciate them trying to include the additional AC screen, and I'm sure it came in handy once or twice on the shoot, but overall the form factor just felt a little bit awkward. Now this camera may be a little bit better if they put it in like an Ursa Mini style body, or obviously even the Pyxis that was just released. But yeah, on the Ursa Cine, it's definitely not your traditional camera by any means. And so if you're used to operating traditional cameras, this one's not going to probably check that box for you. And then to wrap up the form factor, one other thing to note is that Blackmagic is getting more and more popular, but I feel like the ecosystem is still catching up. And so a lot of the accessories and stuff are not as popular as they would be for other cameras. So if you're looking at getting into the system, I would just do your research and make sure that there's all the accessories that you would want, that are kind of your creature comforts that would work on this camera. Because the way that you rig this camera is a little awkward with the dual screens and the way that the screen flips out. It's not a traditional rig out. Now, if you add an additional cage to it, you could get some more rigging options, but then with the camera already being so heavy, you're adding additional weight, so it's just something else to consider. Another con was that this camera was extremely power hungry. So we would put a 150 watt on there and it would last for 20 to 30 minutes, depending on kind of what was all going on and how much we were recording. Which, contrasting that with the BRAW, that camera will run an hour and a half, couple hours, and then the FX6, you could run half a day on that. So this camera would chew through battery. So what we would do is we would have the camera on sticks while we were setting up, and we would plug it into an EcoFlow, kind of running it off of house power. And then whenever it was time to shoot, I would unplug it, and then I would shoot onto the battery, and then, you know, put it back on the sticks and then plug it back in. Now, although I love the sensor, and that's a big thing for me, one thing that I did note and I wanted to make a note of in my cons section was that it's not as good at low light situations as some of the other sensors that I've shot on. So the Alexa Mini LF, the Monstro, the BRAW all have a fairly clean image whenever you're shooting in low light situations, especially if you're shooting on the BRAW at its second native ISO. What I did notice on this particular sensor is that it was a little bit more noisy than what I expected it to be. Now, it cleaned up pretty easy in Resolve, especially with the Resolve's new ultra noise reduction feature that they added in 19, and it's getting better in 20. But it's just something worth noting is that there is a little bit more noticeable noise in this sensor than there is in some of the other higher end cameras. One thing that made my cons list that I want to mention is BRAW. Now, I personally like BRAW and I've had no issues with it, but I did shoot for a studio and they edit on Avid. Now, there's supposed to be a plugin that works with BRAW and it brings it into Avid, but sometimes plugins just don't work. So BRAW was designed, and it obviously handshakes and does very well with DaVinci Resolve. And then for every other NLE, it's just a plugin that brings it into it. So they had an issue with BRAW and it would not go into Avid for whatever reason. And so they would email Avid, and then Avid says, email Blackmagic, then Blackmagic points a finger back at Avid. And so it was just a back and forth. And eventually the spot had to be all transcoded into ProRes. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that if you get into this camera, you have no other option but to shoot in BRAW. So like on the Red, you could shoot in ProRes, or you could shoot in R3D, or on the BRAW, you could shoot in their RAW, or you could shoot in their XAVC-I. So you have a couple different options there, but on this particular camera, your option is BRAW. So if you shoot with studios that don't edit in DaVinci at all times, or they're not very experienced with BRAW, that's something just to keep in mind, is that that is your option. Another big pain point for me was the media. So I rented my system from Lens Rentals, and at the time they didn't have any of the rack mounted readers, and they didn't have any of the modules that took the new CF Express Type B. So I was stuck with Blackmagic's M2 media, which is really good. It's fast. It was very reliable on the shoot. But what it does do is restrict you to only being able to offload directly from the camera, especially if you don't have the rack-mounted reader. So offloading from the camera, you have two options. You have the USB-C on top, or you have the 10 gig Ethernet port in the back. Now, I tried to offload with the USB-C and it was just terribly slow. It's a nice thing to have as a backup, but really you're not going to use that on a day-to-day because it was just, you'd be powering that camera all night trying to offload footage. So your option's really the 10 gig Ethernet port. Now, the 10 gig Ethernet port is definitely something that you want to make sure you have the time to set up, especially if you're just renting this camera for one shoot. Because the way that it works is you have to go to Blackmagic, you have to input the serial number, you have to download a specific application, and then for me, it wasn't necessarily just walking through it. It wasn't like a very easy step-by-step guide, so I had to download the user manual, search through the user manual, then watch some YouTube videos, and eventually I stumbled through and I was able to get this camera set up to where I could offload it through a network on my computer. But that was a kind of a cumbersome process, and it's not something that's just extremely easy or intuitive. It's definitely something that needs to be done in a very particular order. So if you're using the M2 media, it's kind of a con, especially if you're just renting it for a shoot. If it was me and I was trying to rent, or I was going to buy this camera, I would definitely try to opt for the CF Express Type B if they had it in stock. It's just much more user-friendly. And then the last thing that is on my cons list on this camera is reliability. Now, if you watched my previous video, I made a comment that the camera crashed 3 times on us, and I want to explain that a little bit more. So the first time we were recording and the camera was actually plugged into house power, and it had the V mount on it powering the accessories. Now during that, the camera just froze, and then these lines started coming over the screen. You would try to turn the switch off, it wouldn't go off, so eventually you have to pull all power and then hard shut the camera down, and then repower it up, and it was fine. Now that one, we obviously lost the clip. Now for all of those, I think one was on house power and then the other 2 were on V mount. But that being said, with it doing it both times, it didn't feel like it was a power issue. It felt like it was something internal. Now I saw that my video was posted to a couple user groups and they were asking feedback on other users if they had had the same experience. There were some people that had had similar experiences, and then there was some that, you know, sung the praises of Blackmagic's. And they were saying how well that the Blackmagic cameras have treated them. But that being said, because there are other users having this kind of same freezing issue, it tells me that there's probably a glitch or a piece of software that's a little bit broken that's causing this to happen. Now, on one of the users, it was that when they would plug the XLR in, the camera would freeze, and then eventually a software update fixed that. But on my camera, there was no XLR plugged in, and it was on the newest firmware, so I'm not really sure what was going on there. That being said, because we busted a clip, and that being such a personal experience, that's kind of burned into my mind, and that's not something that I want to have that conversation with a director or a producer on a monthly basis. Now, I also understand that every camera is an electronic, and whenever you're producing thousands of these things, that there's going to be ones that slip through the cracks. So I'm sure that it happens on a lot of camera brands, but it's just something that's at the forefront of my mind because I just experienced it. Now, kind of wrapping up my thoughts as I reflect on my week with this camera, if you're on a controlled set or you do a lot of movie shoots or something that's on sticks and dolly, you're chasing the best resolution, picture quality to price ratio, I feel like this camera is definitely worth considering. This sensor is a beast, but paired with this particular body, it's a beast that kind of has to be tamed. The image is gorgeous, and the camera is good. It offers a lot, but it definitely has its quirks and it's non-traditional. So overall, my final thought on this camera is I love the sensor, but I don't necessarily love the camera. The image is gorgeous, but the camera has its quirks, and sometimes it's a little bit of a pain. They obviously just put this sensor into the Pyxis 12K, which is a very attractive camera for the price. It's probably one of the best picture quality to price ratios that exist. But if you need the extra accessories, the extra frame rates, then this camera may be worth the extra $2,000 for you. But all that being said, there's a lot of things that I love about this camera, but there's a few things that are holding me back, so I don't know that it's the right move for me at this time. I'm sharing my journey and what I'm learning along the way. If you want to continue growing together, consider subscribing. This is just the beginning of the conversation.